When we think of a plane crash, we may think of engines failing or pilot error, but something we don't think about is a civilian airliner being destroyed by military action, unless it's recently happened, with the most recent engagements happening to Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752. But this has been happening since the late 1930s, and today we will be moving in between this timeline to talk about the forgotten Soviet attack on Korean Airlines Flight 902. Soviet airspace was arguably the most defended airspace during the Cold War. From long-range surface-to-air missiles meant for aircraft like the B-52 to sophisticated interceptor aircraft, they were a force to be reckoned with. Of the many military incursions that happened into Soviet airspace, civilian airliners were not treated with much mercy, like Korean Airlines Flight 902. This flight was a Boeing 707 jetliner, and we have to talk about the Boeing 707, so feel free to skip ahead in the chapters. The Boeing 707 was the first jetliner produced by Boeing, making its first flight in 1957. Derived from the Boeing 367-80 prototype, it features many civilian variants that improve upon the original design. It also features military variants as well, like the E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control system for monitoring friendly and enemy aircraft, and the E-8 Joint Stars, a ground surveillance aircraft. The 707 has 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, originally the JT-4A, but many airframes had the JT-3D, making its first run in 1958. With that being said, the Boeing 707 was the first commercial jetliner with thrust reversing, giving it the ability to slow down on landing or reverse on the ground in a pinch. Now, the 707 may have dominated the early jet age, but it was by no means the first commercial jetliner, but it still dominated the industry. And the history of the early jet age is written in blood. Over 3,000 people have perished while flying on the 707, whether it be due to pilot error, faults with the aircraft itself, or cowards with malicious intent, with the final crash being in 2019, killing 15 of the 16 on board in Karaj, Iran. The 707 was a freighter operated by Saha Airlines and was the last commercial 707. And now for why you're really here. Korean Airlines Flight 902. Registration Hotel Lima 7429. It was a Boeing 707-321B variant, making its first flight in 1967. And the aircraft allows up to 189 passengers. Some variants allow more than 200, however. Our incident aircraft was carrying 109 occupants that day, 12 crew, and 97 passengers. On April 20th, 1978, Flight 902 took off from Orly Airport in Paris, France at 1:39 p.m. local time to their destination, Gimpo International Airport in Korea. It would stop over at Anchorage, Alaska to relax and refuel. Well, why not cut through Soviet airspace? It would be a much shorter flight, right? Well, the problem is the Cold War. Soviet airspace and many Eastern Bloc airspaces were restricted to many countries, forcing European and most Asian airlines to go around them via Cold War polar routes. And Anchorage, Alaska was a common rest stop for flights from Europe to South Korea and Japan, and vice versa. And remember, this was before GPS navigation, so they had to rely on other methods that we'll get into soon. But for now, in command is Captain Kim Chang-yu. His co-pilot is First Officer Cha Soon-do. The navigator is Lee Gun-sik, and I apologize to my Korean watchers if I'm butchering these names, but you won't have to hear me say the flight engineer's name because he is unknown. As they are flying to Anchorage, Alaska, they are navigating with a gyro compass. The gyro compass is very inaccurate near the North Pole. Their route seems practically in or near something called the magnetic blackout zone, a zone where compass navigation is not recommended. A more accurate way to navigate near the pole would be with something called LORAN, or long-range navigation, essentially navigating via radio stations. But there is a problem. There were stations in Greenland and Iceland, but they were not operational, so they had to rely on the gyro compass instead. But unbeknownst to the crew, the gyro compass is broken. There was some mistrust in it amongst pilot Chang Yu. He would ask the navigator if the gyro compass was working, and Lee said it was, so they would follow it anyway. Now, the flight is going well so far, up until they get to a certain point near the North Pole. It causes their compass to drift significantly. Unbeknownst to the crew, they still follow it, making a sharp right turn in the North Pole. They're not going to Anchorage anymore. They are headed for Murmansk in the Soviet Union. 8:54 p.m. Soviet air defenses spot a contact over 250 miles or over 400 kilometers out, approaching their airspace. Vladimir Dmitriev, general of the 10th Air Defense Army, walks inside his home and barely gets his coat off when he gets a call from a Colonel Samolov about the unknown aircraft. For more than 20 minutes, the Soviets would attempt to contact the unidentified aircraft via radio with no response. Because there's no response, they believe it to be an RC-135 Joint Rivet Reconnaissance aircraft. The 707 and RC-135 are almost identical radar signature-wise. Soon, Flight 902 would cross into Soviet airspace, and around 9 p.m., Captain Alexander Basov would be scrambled in his Sukhoi Su-15 interceptor from Afrikanda Military Airport to intercept the unknown aircraft. The Sukhoi Su-15, NATO reporting name Flag-On, was an interceptor making its first flight in 1962. Early versions could carry two air-to-air missiles called the R-98, both featuring in classic Soviet fashion infrared and semi-active radar homing variants. Semi-active radar homing, meaning the radar has to assist the missile all the way to its target, the radar from the aircraft that is. Later versions, like the Su-15MT, could carry more missiles on its outer wing, called the R-60, an infrared-guided missile. If it ran out of missiles, the pilots could rely on the dual-barrel GSH-23L 23mm cannon. Now, the time it took Basov to get in his cockpit, start up his jet, and get airborne to intercept was 5 minutes. Pretty impressive. The reason he did not shoot down 902 with the surface-to-air missile was because it didn't respond to IFF interrogation, or identify friend or foe, a system that helps distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy aircraft, and the Soviets used constantly changing IFF codes, and on occasion pilots would forget to change these codes, so they would send a fighter to go and investigate. Basov was alongside scanning the aircraft to see the markings to confirm it was a civilian airliner. As he does this, the 707 crew spots him and they immediately turn on all the lights on the aircraft. They were even trying to get into contact with him on the international emergency frequency of 121.5, and they were ready to follow every instruction. It wouldn't have mattered because Basov apparently didn't speak English. Well, why is that? Everyone should speak English when communicating in aviation. Well, it's the Soviet Union and pilots in country weren't required to speak English at the time. Passengers on the 707 saw him as well, and they apparently weren't worried at all. And Basov saw them too, taking pictures of him and even waving at him. This picture you're seeing right now is actually Basov's Su-15 that day, taken by a Japanese passenger, Kishio Otani. Seeing that there are clearly passengers, he relays this to ground commanders, and General Vladimir Dmitriev of the 10th Air Defense Army, from the comfort of his home, tells him to shoot down the aircraft. Initially, Alexander wouldn't, and he would go back and forward with them for several minutes. Then, all of a sudden, passengers see him fly the aircraft away, not returning to home base, but for a shot at the 707. The passengers are completely unaware. As with everything with incidents with other countries, especially when you're dealing with the Soviets, there's two sides to a story. The Soviets said the plane wasn't responding to their communications, and it made a mad dash for Finland, to which wasn't far. This prompted the order for it to be shot down. Whichever you believe, the aircraft was still shot at by an R-60 infrared missile. The first missile Basov fired missed, but the second one hit the tip of the left wing. exploding fragments into the fuselage and injuring 3 passengers, 1 with minor injuries and 1 critical. Sadly, the fragments would kill passenger Bang Tae-hwan instantly. The R-60 was a missile that had just a 6.6 pound warhead, or 3 kilograms. If it used the R-98, it would have been a lot worse, because it has an 88 pound warhead, or 40 kilograms. The aircraft has suffered decompression, so an emergency descent is required so no one suffocates. And Captain Chang Yu dives the plane at 5,500 feet per minute, going from 35,000, approximately 10,000 meters, to 3,500 feet, approximately 1,000 meters. While that's happening, 4 more pilots from the 265th Air Defense Army take off in 4 Su-15s. While chasing Flight 902, they see fragments of the aircraft's wing on their radar. Thinking it's a cruise missile, one of the pilots, we'll just call him Sergei, shoots at it with a radar-guided R-98. At 22:45, Captain Ataly Karapov from the 265th sees Flight 902 at 26,000 feet, approximately 800 meters. Now, the emergency landing did not happen immediately. The Korean pilots were flying with a damaged wing impressively for 40 to 1 hour and 20 minutes. While still flying, the flight crew were in contact with someone via radio outside the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were monitoring all the radio traffic coming from 902, and they were truly able to confirm it was indeed a civilian airliner. The Korean pilots would spot a suitable place to land on a major roadway, but a train was approaching, so they aborted. They would then spot a frozen lake and decide they would land there. As Chang Yu forces the aircraft down on the ice, he deliberately turned to the nose towards land for fears that the ice would break. Captain Kim Chang-yu would make one of the most successful crash landings in history, as there were no fatalities during the landing, only minor injuries. Soviet pilots would actually praise his emergency landing and allegedly use it as a case study. The evacuation of the aircraft did not happen immediately. There was no fire, so they stayed on board the aircraft because they were not prepared for the cold. They were dressed for the mid-April weather in Paris when they left, and not the cold of northern Soviet Russia. For 2 hours, they were sitting in a cold and dark aircraft, quite literally. Rescue would come for them, but it would be a massive feat. Passengers saw troops approaching them, and they thought they were American. But cheers would turn to worry as they saw they were Soviet. But the Soviets tried to treat the passengers well. But Japanese national Yoshitaka Sugano would die from his injuries while being treated by the Soviet personnel. Cameras were confiscated by Soviet troops, but Japanese passenger Kishio Otani would hide his film. That's where we got the shot of the Su-15. And another Japanese passenger named Arekazu Miyo hid his camera and took photos. Translators were brought in from nearby villages to translate in English, and helicopters would take all the survivors to a military town called Kim, where they would stay at an officers' club divided by men and women. They were fed well and given blankets. The passengers and crew were interrogated by the KGB, essentially the Soviet Union's CIA, on the second day. Captain Kim Chang-yu would constantly tell the Soviet interrogators that they had no idea they were entering Soviet airspace until Bosov's Red Star-bearing Su-15 flag-on rolled up on them. But they just wouldn't accept this narrative, and just formed their own, stating that the aircraft was on a spy mission, with a quote-unquote powerful radio they had found, risking the lives of passengers to gather intelligence, justifying the attack. And that's just not true. Former Chief of Staff of the 265th Aviation Regiment, Valery Volodnik, even stated that it wasn't true, and there was no spy equipment on the 707. And if that were true, there would have been no reason for the plane to be full of passengers. And there's an aircraft already meant for stuff like that, the RC-135 I mentioned earlier. That is a reconnaissance aircraft that was intended to gather intelligence without violating airspaces, and would have done a far better job than a civilian 707, and the Soviets should have known better. On day 3, the passengers were released after not being suspected of being spies. However, they did not release the flight crew and held them for additional investigation. And because the Republic of Korea didn't have diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, the United States had to get involved. and the Boeing 727 picked all the passengers up and crew and brought them to nearby Finland, and they were then picked up by another 707 with a working gyro compass. The official Korean report is still classified, but some of them were made public for a lawsuit filed by Bang Tae-hwan's family. The report claimed that navigator Lee Gun-sik was at fault. Although the compass was broken without their knowledge, he should have made sure from time to time that they were on course by using all possible navigation aids he knows. He would refute this and say the pilot was actually at fault because allegedly the pilot knew the gyro compass was broken but decided to fly anyway to arrive on time. Nothing really came from this, however. Captain Kim Chang-yu's pilot certification was revoked and he was put on ground duties. He would later requalify and get it back. After the incident, the Soviet Union requested $100,000 in compensation. South Korea wouldn't pay. And that was the forgotten downing of Korean Airlines Flight 902. A lot of the research for this was in the Korean language, so if something got lost in translation or if I missed something, please let me know and everybody else know in the comments down below. But for now, if you enjoyed, let me know by liking and subscribing, and if you want me to do more longer videos like this, let me know as well. I will see you in the next one. Stay safe, and thank you for listening.